It started with color, bright, bold colors that carried generations of history, pride, and resilience. The Pan-African flag and the Juneteenth flag hung proudly outside a home that had weathered storms far greater than the petty politics of an HOA. For the black homeowner, these weren't just pieces of fabric swaying in the wind. They were living testaments, reminders of ancestors who endured chains, of communities that fought for freedom, of progress hard, earned, and still incomplete. At first, neighbors passed by with curiosity. Some admired the flags, understanding their significance, while others simply appreciated the splash of color against the otherwise uniform suburb. But then came Karen. Her face wrinkled with disapproval, as though the sight of history offended her personal sense of control. To her, the neighborhood wasn't about expression, identity, or freedom. It was about conformity, about neat lawns, identical mailboxes, and silence where voices should be heard. Her first move was subtle, a letter taped to the homeowner's door. It claimed that the flags were too political, and therefore a violation of HOA policy. The tone was sharp, authoritative, dripping with entitlement. But beneath the paper and ink, it wasn't rules she was enforcing, it was prejudice. The homeowner ignored it at first. After all, freedom of expression was protected, and the HOA handbook said nothing about flags. But Karen wasn't the type to give up when her authority was challenged. Within days, more letters followed. Threats of daily fines stacked up like storm clouds, each one bolder and more hostile than the last. Karen patrolled the street, snapping photos of the flags as though gathering evidence for a crime. She whispered to other board members, stirring them into a frenzy. Yet, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of isolating the homeowner, Karen's crusade exposed her ugliness. Neighbors began whispering too, but not in Karen's favor. They remembered the block parties the family had hosted, the times they'd lent tools, helped mow lawns, or looked out for kids playing in the street. People started to see Karen's attacks for what they truly were, not about rules, but about erasing culture and pride. But Karen was relentless. She stood in HOA meetings, her voice shrill, declaring that the flags divided the community. She demanded immediate removal and heavy fines. She framed herself as the defender of peace, but her words revealed a deeper disdain, a fear of anything that didn't fit neatly into her narrow vision of the neighborhood. The homeowner knew then that this wasn't a battle to avoid. It wasn't just about flags anymore. It was about dignity, rights, and standing firm against the quiet, insidious grip of discrimination. So, instead of quietly removing the flags, they chose another path. They documented every letter, every fine, every photo Karen took. They gathered witnesses, neighbors willing to testify about Karen's obsession and harassment. And then, with calm determination, they did what Karen never expected. They took it to court. The decision sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Karen, who thrived on intimidation, suddenly found herself staring at something she couldn't control: the justice system. The HOA board, dragged along by her crusade, realized too late that they were complicit. What was supposed to be a petty battle over flags had turned into a lawsuit that would expose not only Karen's prejudice, but also the HOA willingness to enable her. In the homeowner's hands, the flags were no longer just symbols. They were evidence of freedom clashing against tyranny, of identity resisting erasure, of truth demanding its day in court. As the gavel loomed ahead and the courtroom lights flickered in their imagination, Karen's smug certainty began to crack. For the first time, she wasn't the one dictating the rules. She was about to face judgment. And the battle had only just begun. The courthouse felt colder than expected, its marble floors echoing each step like the sound of inevitability. Karen walked in with the same stiff arrogance she displayed at HOA meetings, clutching a binder stuffed with printed photos of the flags, copies of the fines she had issued, and a face painted with smug confidence. To her, this was already won. She believed the system worked in her favor, that her word carried more weight than truth, but she wasn't ready for what came next. The black homeowner entered calmly, not with stacks of paper, but with a story. A story carefully pieced together with witness statements, timelines, and undeniable evidence. Neighbors who had watched Karen prowl the street were there, ready to speak. Others, who once stayed silent, now stood up, tired of her reign of intimidation. The courtroom was no longer just a legal setting, it became a stage for the truth to finally shine. Karen started her arguments with the same tone she always used. She claimed the flags were too political, that they disrupted the community's peace, that rules were rules. But as she spoke, cracks appeared. The judge asked for specific clauses in the HOA handbook that banned such flags. Karen shuffled through her binder, flipping desperately, but the words weren't there. They never had been. She had built her crusade on air, on bias, on control. The homeowner's attorney rose, steady and composed. They spoke of heritage, of freedom, of the right to expression that transcended HOA power. They pointed to the documented harassment, the daily fines, the letters, the photographs Karen took obsessively. Each piece of evidence painted a picture, not of order, but of discrimination. The neighbors' testimonies sealed it. They described Karen's words, her disdain, the way she weaponized the HOA to silence a family whose only crime was pride in who they were. Karen's face grew tighter with each passing minute. She objected, interrupted, tried to regain control, but the more she fought, the clearer the truth became. The courtroom could see it, the judge could see it. She wasn't protecting community harmony, she was targeting identity. When the homeowner's attorney placed the final photos on the table, images of the Pan-African and Juneteenth flags, waving freely, the silence in the courtroom was heavy, profound. They weren't threats. They weren't violations. They were history, culture, and freedom woven into fabric. The judge's ruling was swift, decisive, and devastating for Karen. The HOA actions were declared unlawful, discriminatory, and a violation of the homeowner's rights. The fines dismissed, the threats condemned, the harassment laid bare for all to see, but it didn't stop there. The court ordered damages to be paid, not just to cover legal fees, but to punish the HOA for enabling Karen's crusade. The gasp in the courtroom was audible. Karen's eyes widened as numbers were read aloud, dollar amounts that would drain the HOA reserves. Her once unshakable control collapsed into panic. She turned to the board members for support, but their faces were pale, ashamed, furious not at the homeowner, but at her. She had dragged them into ruin, and now they would pay the price. The homeowner, sitting quietly through the verdict, didn't gloat, didn't smirk. They simply felt the weight lift, a justice that wasn't just personal, but symbolic. For every person silenced, for every culture dismissed, for every voice pushed down by the small-minded cruelty of people like Karen, this was a victory. As the gavel struck, Karen's world cracked. The HOA, once her weapon, was now her downfall. She stormed out of the courtroom, binder clutched tight, her heels clicking like thunder, but each step rang hollow. The homeowner walked out too, surrounded by neighbors who embraced them, shook their hands, clapped their shoulders. For the first time in a long time, the community felt whole, united not by rules but by shared justice. But even as they celebrated, one thought lingered. What would Karen do next? Would she retreat into silence, licking her wounds? Or would she return, bitter and vengeful, to reclaim the power she thought was hers? The fight felt over, yet the story wasn't done. Because back in the neighborhood, the flags still waved bold, unbroken, undeniable, and Karen still had to face the wreckage she created. Back in the neighborhood, the fallout was immediate. The verdict rippled through the quiet streets like a shockwave. Neighbors who once tolerated Karen's antics now saw her for what she was: not a protector of order, but a tyrant who had nearly destroyed the very community she claimed to preserve. The HOA board was in shambles. Their reserve funds were gutted by the damages they were ordered to pay. Projects stalled, maintenance fees rose, and whispers of dissolving the HOA altogether filled the air. At the center of the collapse was Karen. Her name was on everyone's lips, not with respect, but with blame. She had weaponized the HOA for her own prejudice, and now the neighborhood was paying the price. Karen's once confident stride through the coldest Ak turned into quick, embarrassed walks. Her clipboard disappeared. Her yard, once the neatest on the block, began to wilt as her energy shifted from control to survival. Bills piled up. Her allies on the board resigned one by one, leaving her isolated. She had thought herself untouchable, but the court had stripped her of her power, and the community's cold stares finished what the judge had started. Meanwhile, the black homeowner stood taller than ever. The flags remained exactly where they had always been: bold, beautiful, unyielding. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now waved as they passed by. Some even approached with their own questions, asking about Juneteenth, about the Pan-African flag, about the history and pride they represented. What began as one family's expression turned into a lesson for the entire neighborhood. The flags no longer just belonged to that one household. They had become symbols of resilience and unity for all who dared to stand against oppression. Then came the block's transformation. In quiet defiance, other families began flying their own flags, some American, some cultural, some personal. A patchwork of colors spread across the street, a living mural of diversity that Karen could no longer erase. Where she had sought uniformity, there was now vibrance. Where she had tried to impose silence, there was expression louder than ever. For Karen, each new flag was salt in the wound. She would peek through her blinds, watching as the community grew closer without her. Her calls to the board went unanswered, her emails ignored. No one was willing to be dragged into her schemes again. She had gone from feared enforcer to bitter outcast. But the final humiliation came months later. As the HOA crumbled financially, a vote was held. Neighbors gathered in the very community center where Karen had once barked orders and handed down fines. This time, the decision was unanimous. The HOA, once Karen's kingdom, was dissolved. No more petty fines. No more harassment. The neighborhood was free. When the results were read, cheers erupted. Families hugged. Kids ran through the aisles. And the homeowner, who had endured so much, was lifted up in applause. They had stood their ground, faced down discrimination, and emerged not only victorious but transformative. Their fight had changed the block forever. Karen, however, sat in the back, her face red, her eyes downcast. The very power she had clung to had slipped through her fingers, leaving her with nothing but resentment and shame. She left quietly that night, the door closing behind her like the final chapter of a book no one wanted to read again. As for the homeowner, they returned home to find their flag swaying proudly in the evening breeze. The Juneteenth flag caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing like a beacon. The Pan-African flag rippled against the twilight sky, strong and unbroken. Together, they told a story not of oppression, but of triumph. The neighborhood was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a community reborn, bound by the lesson that silence in the face of hate only empowers it, but unity against it can dismantle even the strongest walls. And as the homeowner watched children laugh and neighbors greet one another with warmth, they knew this truth. Karen had tried to erase them, to erase their pride, but in the end, she had done the opposite. She had amplified it, strengthened it, and set it in stone. Justice wasn't just served in the courtroom. It was served every day the flags flew freely, forever.